Welcome to this brief introduction to the town of Leith before 1920. To introduce myself, my name's Tim Bell and I've lived in Leith for 40 years. For a few years before I retired, I was the port chaplain, going up and down gangways of the incoming ships in the dock. A good deal of Scottish history flowed through Leith, but in getting almost a millennium of distinctive and complicated history down to a 30-minute presentation, I'm missing out a good deal of royal comings and goings, religious controversies, being closely tied up with the doings of that castle and capital city up the road, international trading, industry, and urban developments, and it's been painful to leave out so many interesting and important people, places, events, and issues. The scope and purpose of this presentation is to offer a brief guide to the town and the history of Leith, and it's also an attempt to answer the question, why did Leith vote 6-1 against amalgamation with Edinburgh a century ago? To understand the Leith story, we need to appreciate that Edinburgh is a capital city in the British Isles. All capital cities are in the southeast of their country for solid reasons. One, as a generality, the best of the land lies to the southeast, supporting a larger population. And two, in the medieval period, when these things became fossilized, all roads led to Rome, and indeed most of our trade today is to the south and east. Conversely, the west coast was the end of the known world, going nowhere. Glasgow, Liverpool, and Bristol are much later merchant cities, not capitals. Cardiff Castle is built on an old Roman fort bang on the navigable river just upstream from the open sea. Dublin, of Viking origins, is again on the navigable river close to the sea. And London, again of Viking origins, right on the river. Romans, Vikings, and medieval power centers all needed to control their access to the sea. And here's the capital of Scotland. I'll come back to this map later and attribute it properly. It's useful now to show the lie of the land. That's Leith at the bottom of the page, and Edinburgh Castle and Salisbury Crags and Arthur's Seat and Calton Hill at the top. The itinerant Scottish royal family, with business to attend to all round the country, like other royal families in the British Isles, gravitated to the southeast of the country. And they found this isolated volcanic plug irresistible for its stronghold castle, with its single and very convenient ramp up to it. I think I'm right in saying it was never successfully attacked. The problem was, it was 2 miles from the sea, as the crow flies, but crows don't carry news, and they don't pull carts. The only way to get a horse and cart in and out of the castle is via the bottom of the ramp, now known as Abbey Strand. You could see it squeezed in between Calton Hill and Salisbury Crags there. From there, your route to Leith is either east of Calton Hill, thus Easter Road, or west of it. And all this makes the castle more like 3 miles from the sea. If the lie of the land had been only slightly different, the capital of Scotland would have been Leith. This is not some partisan claim, it's a scholarly statement. In 1128, King David in his castle had to do something that Cardiff, Dublin, and London didn't have to do. He had to secure his access to the sea that was 3 miles away. In David's time, Leith was something like the outline map on the left. He secured as a royal asset the eastern bank of the river mouth, the outside of the curve as the river leaves the mainland and heads for the beach. The outside of the flow is always the deep water channel, and they shored it up to give the ships a more secure berth. The name shore remains. The Logans of Restalrig owned the land. At least some of the Logans had expensive habits like jousting in England, which wasn't cheap. and over a few generations they sold the land to the Edinburgh burghers. See on the map on the right that by the late 1400s the land behind the shore belongs to Edinburgh. On his deathbed, Robert the Bruce, hero of Bannockburn in 1328, gave the burghers of Edinburgh, who now owned the land, the right to levy a tax on every ton of goods that passed in either direction across the shore. Medieval commerce was structured on monopoly and control, and town burghers were given the sole right to trade within the town walls. And they had market squares. It was quite exceptional in this case that Edinburgh burghers had the right to trade outside the Edinburgh walls in Leith. From Edinburgh, as a royal borough, the ever-greedy kings had the power to demand taxes to support the royal family, and naturally enough, Edinburgh used Leith as a source of income. While other towns around the country had their market squares, Leith never had a market square or a natural focal point. I've chosen Selkirk almost at random, and the place at the bottom, I have no idea where it is. Maybe you recognize it. It could be anywhere in Western Europe, and that's my point. Leith was uniquely exceptional, not just in the British Isles, but throughout Europe. Leith wasn't the only medieval seaport that adopted the Madonna and Child as an icon. I think Ghent in Belgium and Brest in Western France also had it. The coin of 1563 means it was already strong and familiar by then, and somewhere along the line, the distinctive motto of the town of Leith, Persevere, became attached. And it may be that the version on the right is older than the coin by a few decades. It's obviously been painted over more recently, and the wooden block it's on now is in a more modern screen in St Mary's Church, now known as South Leith Parish Church. Icon and motto are strong identifiers of the port and town of Leith, and we'll come back to them. And as a personal aside, when I was port chaplain, I had fridge magnets and postcards to give to the seafarers. There must be hundreds of them now, stuck on cabin doors and on the high seas, and in family homes around the world. As a religious icon, it's lost none of its potency. So now we come to the time of the Petworth Map, so called because the original was found in Petworth House in Surrey. It was drawn up during the siege of Leith in 1560. The mother of Mary Queen of Scots, Mary of Guise, had called in French troops to build a defensive wall. It was by 10 years the first of its type in Britain, with its walls built to withstand artillery fire. The map itself is interesting because it's a map of Leith, accurately drawn. At the top, that's a contemporary note found with the original, and a bird's eye perspective of Edinburgh. Map and perspective in the same document. It's been transposed onto a modern map of the town. Note that the orientation has been flipped here. It's the north to the top. Junction Street is pretty well along the lines of the southern wall, and Constitution Street is along the eastern wall. But look at the detail of the most southwesterly bastion. That's the lower left, the tip pointing to Madeira Street. Leith Library and Thomas Morton Hall on Ferry Road are just off the right, to the right of this photo. The otherwise very strange and unexplained alignment of the wall where it says William Purvis seems to be in line with the southern wall of the bastion. The covered trench in the roadway supports the idea that property boundaries and drainage were never realigned to match the later roadway and properties. We even have a wee bit of artwork in the fuse box to support me here. So we come to Mary Queen of Scots herself and her arrival in 1561. This painting's almost 300 years later, and it's wildly anachronistic. The tower at the back seems clearly to put it on the lower shore, which was certainly not built up with tenements in 1561. Contemporary reports are pretty clear. She arrived a few days earlier than expected. There was nothing like this welcome party, and she had to make the most of her arrival. She said she was pleased to be in sunny Leith, even though some said there was a sea hard on the day of Presbyterian fog. I'm not sure that she was speaking in English, but it stuck. And even if it was never said, it had the legs on it to last 4.5 centuries as a local joke. I took that photo on a wet day in the docks, and the proclaimers have said explicitly that it gave rise directly to their song Sunshine on Leith, and later the musical of that name. Mary needed money, and Leithers lent her some in the hope that in gratitude she would release them from the burden of effectively paying Edinburgh's bills. However, she needed more money, and she mortgaged to Edinburgh her royal authority to demand Edinburgh's revenue from Leith. It didn't end well. When she lost her head, Leithers lost their money, and Edinburgh acquired the royal warrant to give themselves the power to control trade in Leith. It was already an obsolete and anachronistic arrangement, and it lasted until 1828. For example, poor William Duff. They put him in irons during the council's pleasure, and they wouldn't let him go even after his apology. And again, during the Cromwellian occupation of Leith. Leith grievances against Edinburgh are not modern confections. When Royalist forces were defending Leith in the Cromwellian wars, Sir Alexander Leslie threw up a defensive wall from the top of the Kirkgate. We now know it as the foot of the walk to Calton Hill. Never fully fortified, and it wasn't much more than a long mound. It may have been one of those jobs that soldiers get when there's nothing much else to do. Daniel Defoe later described how, if they kept horses and carts off it, there was a good going walkway, which is certainly the origins of the name. When Leslie was defeated and Cromwellian troops occupied Leith, things were different. That's how it goes in an occupation. Civil law is suspended, and the law is the law of the occupier. For a glorious decade, Edinburgh was a suburb of Leith, and Leith did rather well. For example, what may have been Scotland's first newspaper, the Mercurius Caledonius, was published in Leith, and they learned glassmaking. But the burghers of Edinburgh knew that armies come and armies go, rarely leaving behind things as they found them. Towards the end of the army's stay, they made a huge payment to General Monk. Records of who exactly received it and what it paid for don't exist, which strongly fuels speculation that it was a bribe not to destroy Edinburgh's hold over Edinburgh on departure. If so, it was money well spent. And they bought the citadel. It probably wasn't much use to them operationally, but it was a statement and a show of Edinburgh's restored authority in Leith. Moving rapidly on to the 18th century, recognition should be given to Leith races held on the beach at low tide for a week or so in late July or early August. They weren't just a colourful part of Leith life, they were very significant in Scottish life. With the possible exception of Glasgow Fair, It was the largest assembly of ordinary people in pre-industrial Scotland. Ferguson's poem, Leith Races, is about 20 stanzas and the horses are barely mentioned. It's mostly about the ribaldry, the gambling, the courting and the fighting, and horses aren't the most prominent detail in the painting either. The painting is much later than the poem, which is of the scene in the last years of the races before they finally moved to Musselburgh. We're looking westwards in the painting from approximately where Edinburgh Dock is now. That's somewhere to the north of the Pond pub on Salamander Street. The tower with the flag is the round tower that's still on the shore. To the right, in the water, is the Martello Tower, built during the Napoleonic Wars. There was a Martello Tower at many key points on the British coastline, which signals the importance of Leith. And notice the almost conical glass furnaces to the left on the skyline. Wine drinkers around the world can thank Leith for the bottle that is parallel-sided with a long neck and sloping soldiers. That's the Leith pattern. In the same period of the heyday of the races, slightly to the south is Leith Links. The horse racing in the previous slide was just off the top of this map on the beach, and the links were dunes. Jim Scanlon's making a presentation about golf on Leith Links, so look out for it. This map's important because it shows just how much the town developed on the shore side of the river mouth. The dense medieval street pattern, everything except the marketplace. This is the side that the ships tied up. The west side is a much looser street pattern, laid out for industries that needed a bit of space, sailmaking, warehousing, shipbuilding. And next we look at the upper two quarters of the map from the top left. The port of Leith was threatened with a naval bombardment in 1779, and the authorities realized that their key asset was under-defended. They built a barracks, instantly known as the fort, although it was never fortified, just up the slope from a naval dockyard that never materialized. The barracks are long gone, but the gateway and the guardhouses are unchanged. To the south and east of the fort is North Leith Church. Edinburgh had a new town. Why shouldn't Leith have a new town? North Leith Parish Church, opened in 1816, was going to be the centrepiece of the new town. The ceiling inside is suspended from 70-foot single timbers, the full width of the building, that were brought over from North America. The contractor who was doing repair work here a few years ago said that Leith buildings often have the best timbers. Trading restrictions notwithstanding, the locals had their little way. Edinburgh New Town had been built in a wave of prosperity. They started on Leith New Town in the Depression after the Napoleonic Wars, and the Leith New Town never really arrived. Moving eastwards, we're in the town centre. Look at Bernard Street, the broad street in the middle. You'll see it's called St. Bernard Street, but that was incorrect. It was named after one Bernard Lindsay, well-known innkeeper, a wealthy man. He was behind the development of the street piazza style as a social town centre of sorts. The domed building on the right in the top image, looking eastwards, was the Leith Bank, set up in 1792 and issuing its own banknotes. On the opposite side of the street, to the left, my bike and the car directly in front of the building are not parked on the pavement. They are the former gardens of the houses, and the council pavement is limited to the narrow corridor beside the roadway. These were for well-to-do people, and they needed the assembly rooms facing the camera at the end of the street. To the left of the assembly rooms, just out of sight, was the Corn Exchange that set benchmark prices for southern Scotland and northern England. Looking westwards on the bottom photo, you see the little turn in the street as it approaches the bridge at Shore. Bernard Street was never built for east-west traffic. It was the Bernard Street Bridge that opened up the flow from Portobello to New Haven. So let's take stock of Leith in 1817. Several strong winds were blowing. Edinburgh was bankrupt and in no position to invent in the new technology of the docks. Further, there was some question that the medieval provisions for control over the maritime trading extended beyond the shore. And in 1828, Edinburgh lost control over Leith trading and Leith Docks Commission was set up. James Scott Marshall was surely right when he wrote that for centuries Leith was an exciting place. The Edinburgh authorities were always there to be outwitted, and it mattered who you talked to and who knew what. Leith was in a strong position to trade, and the hustle was in the heart of the town. The 19th century was the century of municipalities, and Leith set about the business very seriously. This, unchanged, is their council chamber, police station with cells, and administration block. They had their police force. Don't you love the Madonna and Child on the helmet? They built and maintained schools. In the early 1860s, the water of Leith at Leith was officially the most foul waterway in Scotland, not surprising since Palermo and Corstorphine upstream used it as an open sewer, and it was an easy means of disposal for the tanneries upstream, getting rid of the scrapings off the hides they were working on. So Leith put piped water into the houses. Leith Shore was one of the first streets in the world to be lit by electricity, after streets in New York and London, and well before Edinburgh. Electricity was the first fuel that could be delivered above the source of light, and look how they enjoyed the curve in the lamp standard. They cleared slums and built tenements. They built a tramway much better than Edinburgh's. And you could take exactly that scene now for the trams to make a return. The municipality adopted this version of the Madonna and Child on a ship and under a cloud, which is the Holy Spirit. Other versions have them under the sun or a canopy. There's no single definitive version. And this large blue version in the center was and still is on the street lamps. That's the recent photograph. Many Leith institutions used and adapted the same device. The motto of persevere in the window at the bottom refers to the present pandemic. It's a strong identifier for the town. Leith has always benefited from new arrivals, and we'll look at two significant 19th century emigrations. From Leith sailed the largest whaling fleet in the world, owned by Christian Salvesen, a Norwegian immigrant. The instructions on the harpoon gun on the shore, still there, are in Norwegian. The Norwegian church on North Junction Street, now the Leith School of Art, was the first Norwegian Seamen's Mission church outside Norway. And in the 19th century, there was a very significant immigration from Ireland. They were often a mobile workforce, building remote infrastructure that's lasted well, canals, railways, reservoirs, urban buildings, and sometimes there were seasonal workers on the farms. They didn't always get on very well with the static Scottish population, but in Leith, they seemed to get on very well. I love the tablet above the pub at Yard Heads. It's dated 1833. The thistle on the top tells you you're in Scotland, and the shamrocks on either side and the harp in the middle speak of Ireland. It's one of very few positive contemporaneous acknowledgements of the contribution of the Irish in 19th century Scotland. They were mostly Catholic, bringing a well-educated and confident priesthood. The Presbytery House in Leith, in the main picture, was the first post-Reformation house for Catholic men in Scotland. The founder of their order, Eugene de Mazenot, as a child had experienced warfare, poverty, and migration, and service to such folk is contained in their founding mission statement. There were plenty such among the Irish, and of course the sailors, a migrant population if ever there was one. The river was busy, right up to Junction Bridge. Since 1969, the river mouth is held back at about 1 foot higher than mean high tide, and we need a bit of imagination now to understand that seagoing ships could get this far. They may not have been as big as they have it in this picture. Hawthorne's yard in the centre specialised in conversion from sail to steam. To make the point, 4 men are pulling a boiler over the bridge to take into the yard. There's another ship coming upstream, but they would never have 2 ships that size on the water at the same time. The picture on the right is taken from the far end of the bridge towards where the steam train is. That slope isn't incidental. Thomas Morton devised a system of sailing a ship to the bottom of the slope over cradles he had placed there and hauling the ship sideways out of the water. It could only work for fairly small vessels, but he could do big jobs and small jobs, sometimes having a ship back in the water on the next tide. But he was boxed in by the new railway. Thomas Morton was a generous benefactor to North Leith Parish Church, and the Thomas Morton Hall behind the library is named after him. The railway line is now a very pleasant walkway and cycle path. The town was bustling too. Here's told with wine. Look at that street lamp. And the Kirkgate. The church wall on the right of the top photo with the vertical nick is still there, and Trinity House opposite. They are the only survivors of the 1960s demolitions. Trinity House was a long-standing Leith institution with medieval origins, looking after many aspects of maritime affairs. They were wealthy, and they owned a lot of land in the suburb now called Trinity. Leith Hospital was opened and maintained with a huge effort for the community. The cooperative movement found a ready home in Leith. It was very ambitious. They went in for affordable housing, much of it colony style, but some tenements as well, like the council tenements. They were involved with Chancellor Mill, a very sizable undertaking just up Ferry Road and right beside the railway. In the shops, everybody had a dividend number, sometimes credited in stamps. All the kids who were sent to the shops had to remember their mum's divvy number. I remember mine, though it wasn't in Leith. It was a good way to run up some credit. And we come to the railways. This map is dated 1928, but very little had changed in a quarter century. So imagine this map, at least as far as we're concerned here, to be the case in 1903. Leith had a central station. a dedicated passenger station when most of railway money was in freight. Only the Caledonian Princes Street station in North British Waverley and Leith Central are marked as passenger stations. You can see it at the end of the blue spur just under the name Leith on the map. It was a considerable presence and it needs an explanation. North British Railway Company had just put up 30% of the cost of the fourth bridge and they needed to increase their capacity through Princes Street Gardens to make good on their investment. They also needed to thwart the Caledonian Railway Company's plans to run a loop through Leith docks. To get their way on both counts, they undertook to build a dedicated passenger line and station in Leith. In 1903, it opened. You can go to the exact spot where this main photograph was taken, and the only differences are that the ridge of the station roof to the left of the clock tower is no longer there, and neither is the bridge up Leith Walk. Look at the size of Leith Central. These are later photographs, obviously. At 3 acres, it was the largest station to be opened in the British Isles in the 20th century. Not just large in acreage, it was also large in engineering. To avoid a level crossing at Easter Road, they brought it in at first floor level. The new block just to the left of the Persevere pub now occupies the gap through which the engine is passing. So in the main photograph, the Persevere pub is to the left of the engine as we're looking at it at street level. And the two people in the bottom image are below the carriages. Platform level was above the third tier of rough stone. To fulfill the North British obligations, a single track line, a single open platform and a shed would have been enough. There were 4 platform edges and several sidings, all raised to first floor level and under a magnificent roof made by Sir William Arrol, who wasn't cheap. There are no pre-1920 images of the interior that I can find, but in the 1960s photo on the right, the first thing you see is the squalor. What happened to Leith Central Station is a 20th century story. But for now, just look at the quality of the tiling. And there were nice, comfortable waiting rooms. No expense was spared. There is no explanation that I'm aware of for the size, the extravagant engineering, and the quality of the finishing. Several wealthy Leith families left Leith, taking advantage of the easy commute to the likes of Colinton and Balerno, possibly with a change of train at Waverley. It's now a superstore, and a car park. But in 1920, it was an object of great pride and potential, Leith's direct access to the outside world. And a few years later, in the absence of a market square at the foot of the walk, the nearest thing to the heart of the town, just outside the station, Leith was important enough to get Lord Rosebery to the unveiling of the statue of Queen Elizabeth, Empress of India. And there in a bas-relief on the plinth is this resplendent Britannia reviewing the Leith volunteers for the elevated virtues of patriotism and loyalty in the Boer War. And not much later, soldiers in the Leith Battalion of the Royal Scots were most of the casualties in the worst British Railways accident in loss of life ever to the present. They were on a troop train bound for Liverpool and onwards to the Dardanelles when, just a mile short of the English border, there was a collision. The signalman and another man were found guilty of misconduct. They certainly did make fatal mistakes, but the deeper truth is that was to meet wartime demand, the company was running outdated rolling stock too fast on an overcrowded network. Although they hadn't left the country, because they were in uniform and under orders, they were deemed to have fallen in action, and they had a full military funeral. Almost no family in Leith was left untouched. Here's the funeral procession on Pilgrim Street before turning left into Rosebank Cemetery and the mass grave. Leith was furious that Edinburgh didn't fly the flag at half-mast in order, they said, not to depress morale further in the middle of a war that was going badly. This memory was very fresh when it came to the Edinburgh Extension Act 5 years later. And when it came to 1920 and the Edinburgh Extension Act, to say that urban development between Leith and Edinburgh was unbroken was an understatement. Streets had been built regardless of the boundary, such that the boundary went through buildings and even single houses and flats. The photograph on the left seems to have been taken from position B on the map. Leith was completely surrounded by municipal Edinburgh. And so we come to 1920. The Leith Borough Council was implacably opposed to amalgamation with Edinburgh and held a plebiscite, we'd now call it a referendum. The results were unequivocal. Almost 30,000 against and a little over 5,000 in favour. Depends where you look, you can get other figures, but they all end up around 6-1 against. The Leith Observer had no doubts. Edinburgh has now declared its intention to draw into its voracious maw the borough of Leith. There should be no weakening of the line, no parleying with the weak-willed and the supine, no bowing to the Moloch that seeks to devour us. Other opinions were available. Some said that Leith would fit into Edinburgh as the Canongate had in an earlier century. The Trades Council and the Labour Party said there was nothing in the proposal that would prejudicially affect the working classes, and indeed, that through unification, many benefits would accrue to that class. They should not listen to the mouthpieces of their class opponents. Leith MP, Captain Wedgwood Ben, with a famous son who said he was proud to have been born in Leith, and grandson, spoke passionately in the House of Commons. A very distinctive Leith identity and social cohesion had grown up, he said, which deserved respect and should be regarded as an asset. He said Leith was unique. There's no way of measuring that now, but quite possibly he was quite right. If the time had come for municipal convergence, and it had throughout the country, many centuries of oppression and almost a century of municipal pride and achievement couldn't easily be put aside. Other areas that came within municipal Edinburgh in 1920, Liberton, Corstorphine, Collington, Grammond and others, were settlements in their own right with their own distinctive history, and they had also rather obviously become recent suburbs of the expanding city centre. Leith was never a suburb or a ghetto. It has always been a town with its own very distinctive history. In Leith, amalgamation with its near neighbour was always going to be controversial. Anyway, the Extension Act came to pass in November 1920, and upon its demise, Leith Council entrusted some of its regalia to Trinity House, and in the 1950s it was stolen, never to be recovered, from Huntly House, which is in Edinburgh. Well, if you think there was a lot of content in this presentation, believe me when I say that the painful bit was leaving good content out. If you ask another Leither about Leith, you'll get another cut through the core material, and that's not a problem. That's history for you. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you very much. Goodbye.